Welcome everyone to today's session on the importance of an employee handbook. My name is Lori Dahlberg and I am an HR consulting manager here with Eide. I've been with the firm for 17 years, started out in a general office administrator role, moved into firm-wide recruitment, and have been in human resources consulting for the past 2.5 years. So my role is to help clients with any and all HR matters, and certainly one of the big ones that comes up is the topic of employee handbooks. What I will be doing today is talking with you about some best practices with regards to employee handbooks. And certainly at the end of the session, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer those, or if you'd like to follow up with me after the webinar, my contact information is here, and I welcome any and all inquiries. All right, to start off, I'd like to throw out a statistic, and it's something that a lot of employers don't actually understand, and that is that employers face a 12% chance of employee litigation. And if your organization has 500 employees or fewer, that rate actually climbs to around 20%. What that means is that employees who do not feel that they are being treated fairly in the workplace pursue litigation against their either current employer or their former employer. And the types of things that they tend to litigate are discrepancies with regards to wage and hour violations under the Fair Labor Standards Act. They file claims of harassment, whether that's hostile work environment harassment, bullying, or sexual harassment. They file claims of discrimination. Oftentimes, if someone's terminated, they will file a claim for wrongful termination. Other claims include on-the-job injury due to employer negligence, and then also immigration-related issues. And whenever an employee or a former employee chooses to sue an employer, it can not only be an expensive business issue, it can take up significant time and also damage the reputation of the company. So one of the ways that you can mitigate litigation is to have a solid employee handbook in place. And that employee handbook should outline your expectations as well as your compliance with state and federal employment laws. And many of the things that we talk about today are going to fall into those categories. So I'd like to start things off with a polling question. And I'd like to know that out of the over 120 individuals on the call, how many of you have an employee handbook currently? All right, so it looks like a majority of you do have an employee handbook, which is great. Those of you who do not, I strongly encourage you to consider putting together an employee handbook, or if you lack the time and the resources to do that, let me know, because I would be happy to work with you on that. So the next thing we're going to cover is we're going to define what an employee handbook actually is, because there are a number of ideas out there as to what an employee handbook should entail, whether it's a process manual or a program guide. An employee handbook is a document that is written with the employees as the intended audience. And it is written in pretty straightforward terms, layman terms, so that employees actually understand the content of it and can understand the policies and the procedures that the company has out there. It's a vehicle for familiarizing employees with basic policies and benefit programs. So this is just intended to be the basics. And if an employee has further questions, they can certainly talk to individuals. And it also outlines general expectations of the company as to what the company considers to be acceptable and unacceptable behavior in the work environment. So when should someone have an employee handbook? Well, if you have more than a few employees, you absolutely should have a handbook, because federal employment laws actually apply when you only have one or more employees. So the second you opened your doors for business and you hired an individual to come work for you, there are federal employment laws that actually apply. As you grow and add additional employees to your head count, there are more laws that will apply, and additional laws are added on when you hit 11 employees, and then again when you hit 15 employees, 20 employees, 50, and then 100. What that means is that when you hit 15 employees, there are additional laws that are in place. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is one of the ones that pops into place when you hit 15. When you hit 20 employees, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act and the COBRA regulation kick into play. At 50 or more employees, you need to be compliant with the Affordable Care Act, with Family Medical Leave Act, and you also must have an affirmative action program. And then there are additional laws that kick in once you're over 100 employees. So watching your head count to ensure that you've got the right elements in your handbook becomes pretty critical. We're going to do another polling question just so I can get a sense for how large your organization is. So how many employees do you have in your organization? Do you have 10 or fewer, 11 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 49, 50 to 100, or more than 100? Interesting. All right, so we have individuals who have employee counts all across the board, but it does look like the majority of folks out there actually have head counts of more than 100 employees. And what that means is that you need to have a very comprehensive handbook that addresses not only your company policies, but also all of the state, federal, and maybe even city or county regulations that are in play when it comes to employment-related issues. So what does an employee handbook do? Well, really the intent of an employee handbook is to communicate important information to employees so that they understand really what is expected of them. A handbook also demonstrates your compliance with federal and state laws so long as you actually follow those policies. And why should you have an employee handbook? Well, there are a variety of reasons for that, and we are going to cover a number of them. First of all, the very first section of a handbook is a great opportunity for an employer to explain to a new hire what their culture, mission, and values are. It can be something that you pull right off of your website, or it can be something that's more in line with what you want specific employees to understand. But basically, it should include what does your organization do that sets you apart from others, and how did the company get there? So a little bit of history, as well as what your focus is with regards to culture, mission, and values can be a great way to introduce employees to your company. The next thing that should be in an employee handbook is an area that allows you to communicate to employees what is expected of them. Employees want to know how they're supposed to request time off, or what to do if they need to call in sick. What is their responsibility regarding safety in the work environment? And what's the dress code? There are a whole host of other questions that employees will have, can be addressed in your employee handbook so that it can be used as a reference point even beyond orientation day. Employee handbooks also inform employees about what they can expect from management and leadership. For example, in your handbook, you can include your hours of operation. Are you a 24/7, 365 operation? Are you a Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 operation? Do you have different shifts? You can put all of that into your handbook so that employees understand from a bigger perspective what the company's operating hours are. You can also include in there pay dates so that employees understand, are they being paid once a month? Are they being paid every other week on a Friday? Are they paid on the 1st and the 15th? It helps to outline their expectation for when they can receive their paycheck. It also should include the section on entitlements under federal and state leave laws, such as FMLA or jury duty leave, time off to go vote, those types of things. And having that in your handbook allows employees, again, a reference point to go back to beyond day one when they have something pop up that they're unsure of how to handle it. They can refer back to the employee handbook to see, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Employee handbooks also help ensure that key policies are consistently communicated, right? So any policy that you have in your handbook, it must be practiced consistently. It also is an opportunity to outline how you review expected conduct and behavior. And your employee handbook can actually be a great reference point for managers. If an employee is not following a policy, they can go back to the employee handbook and show the employee, hey, don't you see that here on this particular policy, this is the expectation, and we're not seeing that from you. So they can use it as a reference point and a tool to guide employees back to behaving and performing the way that is expected. Employee handbooks also allow you to showcase your benefits. And this section is usually a little bit smaller than people would expect because benefits change every year. And sometimes the amount that an employer wants to put into an employee's benefits can change from year to year as well. So in the benefits section, really all you want to do is just indicate eligibility requirements so that you're outlining which employees are eligible for benefits, whether it's employees who work 30 hours or more, or if it's 20 hours or more, you want to put those eligibility requirements in there. And then just a listing of the benefits that are offered with some general information. Employee handbooks also should showcase policies regarding time away from the job. For example, if you offer paid vacation, paid holidays, or any other type of paid leave, you will want to have that in your handbook. And if you allow unpaid leave, whether it's a personal leave of absence or unpaid leave to participate in jury duty and allowing the employee to keep their jury duty pay, you will want to outline those as well in your employee handbook. Handbooks also ensure compliance. So all state and federal laws that relate to employment should be part of your handbook, because that will not only demonstrate your commitment towards being compliant with state laws, it will also allow employees to see what their rights are under those state laws. Employees oftentimes have a misperception with regards to employment laws, and having them documented in your handbook can allow them the opportunity to really understand what their rights are and how you plan to approach things. Employee handbooks also let employees know where to go for help. So if you have a specific person that is in charge of all matters with regards to workplace violations, you'll indicate that in your employee handbook. If somebody needs to file a claim of harassment or workers' compensation claim, you'll want to make sure that you include who that person is within your organization. Sometimes you'll want to put a name, but most often what you'll want to put is a business title. For example, contact the Human Resources Director if you need to file a claim of harassment. Contact the safety manager if you need to file a claim or if you need to let them know of any type of workplace injury. By allowing employees to see who they're supposed to go to and including that in your handbook, that allows you to keep things in-house and prevents an employee from trying to report sexual harassment or an injury in the workplace to someone outside of the organization, such as an attorney. So keeping it in-house can be pretty important, and one way to do that is to provide them with information on who to contact when they have any type of an issue. Employee handbooks also help defend against employee claims. So in circumstances where an employee wants to make a claim against the organization, utilizing the employee handbook so that they have that structure for who to go to and a process to follow can demonstrate that the employer has shown reasonable care towards its employees when it comes to those types of circumstances. For example, your preventing harassment policy might state that, hey, if somebody's bothering you, first thing you should do is let that person know that what they're doing is bothering you. If you're not comfortable with that, go to your supervisor. If that doesn't work, go to Human Resources. And then Human Resources will determine if an investigation needs to take place. So outlining all of that allows the employee to see that the employer really does want to make the work environment a better place and therefore is exercising reasonable care. The other thing an employee handbook can do for an employer is it creates an opportunity for consistency. That way you are not playing favorites. If you have a policy in place and you are exercising that policy across the board, it shows consistency and it makes it less likely that somebody can file a claim of discrimination in the workplace because they were treated differently than someone else. having a policy in your handbook can really help with that. So one of the big questions that I always get when it comes to employee handbooks is, what on earth should I include in my employee handbook? And what we're going to do is go through several different sections that you will want to include, and then within those sections are specific policies that you may or may not want to include. With the introduction, that's the section where you're going to have that company history, the mission, vision, and values. This is your intro to a new hire. When they're going through orientation, you're going to want to cover this page so that they really get a feeling for what the company is all about. And having that introduction is a great way to welcome a new hire to your organization. The next section should be your compliance section. And in the compliance section, you will want to make sure that if you are an at-will state, that you have your at-will employment clause. The at-will employment clause states to an employee that by state law, your employment is at will, meaning you can terminate your employment at any time for any reason with or without notice, and so can the company. All right, so you want to make sure that you have that at-will statement in there. The other compliance piece that you want is your EEO statement, the Equal Employment Opportunity Statement, demonstrating that you do not discriminate against individuals on any of the protected factors. Those protected factors include things like race, national origin, color, disability, veteran status, those types of things. The other compliance piece that you want to include is your conflict of interest policy, so that employees are aware of how they can handle a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is any type of relationship, whether it is business or personal, that could negatively affect the business. For example, you would have in your conflict of interest policy that an employee may not have a second job doing the exact same thing that they currently do for you. That would be a conflict of interest. Or an individual can't work on a customer's account if they have a relationship, a personal relationship or a familial relationship with that individual. So you want to make sure that you outline that conflict of interest policy. And then you want to make sure you have a confidentiality policy, a policy that states that anything the employee learns or does within the organization cannot be shared with individuals outside of the organization, and that goes to just the day-to-day interactions and dealings. They can't share company information, client or customer information, contact information, financial information, any of those kinds of things. So having those in your compliance section right off the bat is a good element of your employee handbook. You then want to have a conduct section. And in the conduct section, you'll include things like your dress code, your anti-discrimination policy, and your anti-harassment policy, your substance-free policy, which would include drugs and alcohol. It may also include a smoke-free work environment policy, and if you have a smoke-free work environment, I highly recommend you add e-cigarettes and vape sticks to that policy, because those seem to be ones that employees think that because it is not actual smoke that they can do that in the work environment. For nonprofits, you will want to have a political activity policy, and that policy basically states, hey, we want employees to be actively involved in politics. They just can't do it while they're at work, and they can't do anything that would be disparaging to the reputation of the organization. And then last in the conduct section is your disciplinary action process. That should include something like a progressive discipline policy, where if an employee is not meeting standards or is in violation of a policy, they will receive a verbal warning. Then it will be a written warning. There could be a performance improvement plan, and then there could be suspension or termination. So it's progressive, and then that policy should also state that if, depending upon the issue, the employer can go to any one of those steps at any point in time. So somebody could go immediately to termination, depending upon what the violation is. Under the workplace guidelines, in that section, you're going to include things like your work hours. So again, Here's when the operating hours of the organization are. We're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, or we operate Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. Whatever your work hours are, put them out there, because even if it doesn't apply to every employee should know that. For example, if you have office staff who work Monday through Friday 8 to 5, but your organization is open 7 days a week, office staff should know that. So having those standard work hours, and if you have specific shifts, you can list your shifts as well. That is really important information for employees to know. If you allow employees to work from home, you should absolutely have a work from home policy, and included in that policy can be things such as, if you have children, they must have daycare separate from your home. And if there are certain hours you want them to work, that they need to be available and logged in online, you can include that. So you'll want to include that if you do allow work from home. Lunch and break periods, those are state law governed, so make sure that you look up your state laws and indicate what the lunch and break periods are. There are several states that don't require break periods, so just be wary of what your state requires and include that in your policy. You'll also want to include a workplace safety policy, and if you are an organization that has a manufacturing facility or a warehouse, there are likely stricter and more stringent workplace safety requirements. Make sure you include those. In workplace guidelines, you also want to make sure that you outline the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially if you have over 15 employees. You'll basically state what the Americans with Disabilities Act is and your compliance with it by providing reasonable accommodation for individuals who require it. The use of company equipment is also a good thing to put into this workplace guidelines section. With today's well-connected world that we live in, employees are using company property for personal reasons, and you need to lay out what your expectations are. Is it okay for an employee to utilize their work computer to send a personal email? Can they utilize the telephone to make a personal call? If you have company vehicles, are they allowed to use company vehicles for personal reasons? Make sure that you outline those things clearly. And then attached with that is the electronic communication policy, which can include social media, email, internet, all of those different elements. And you absolutely should have a policy in place that states that anything that an employee does through social media can reflect back on the company, and to be aware that it may be monitored, and that if an employee is utilizing work email or work computers, work phones, that they can be monitored. So there is no right to privacy when you are utilizing company equipment for personal use. With the social media policy, the other thing I like to point out is it is impossible to ban individuals from utilizing social media in the workplace. A better approach would be to help employees understand how their personal social media profile can affect the company, and to actually provide them with some tools on how to utilize social media to better the company. For example, utilizing their personal social media to promote open job positions or exciting things that you have going on at the organization that would be public knowledge. So really kind of helping them understand things from that perspective, as opposed to just flat out saying, no, you can't use it, because that's not realistic. Under the communication piece, which is a separate section, you will include things like pay periods and pay deductions, job classifications. That would include stating whether an employee is exempt from overtime or non-exempt, as well as what full-time employment means, what part-time employment means, if you have interns, if you have temporary employees, if you have seasonal employees. You will want to outline what all of those different job classifications are, and that is also a good place to indicate whether a specific job classification is eligible for benefits or not. Within the communication piece, you also will want to include information on salary and bonuses, meaning if you do pay increases on an annual basis at a specific time, you'll want to indicate that. You know, the company reviews compensation on an annual basis in June, and pay adjustments are made effective on the July 1 pay period. If you offer bonuses, it's a good idea to indicate in there that, you know, certain eligible individuals are eligible for bonuses, and those will be communicated by their performance manager. Or if you have a set bonus, if we achieve X amount of revenue, we will pay out a certain percentage from the revenue in the form of a bonus to all employees. So if you don't offer bonuses, don't have a section there. If you don't do pay increases, don't have that. But if those are portions of your business that you actually have, then definitely include them so employees know what to expect. Same thing goes for performance reviews. If you do performance reviews, it's a good idea to put that in there, how often an employee can expect to have their performance reviewed, and if there are any specifics on what you are reviewing, certain competencies or behaviors or output, you can include that as well. Notifying employees of the processes for promotions and transfers is also a good thing to include in this section, as well as travel expenses and how to handle getting reimbursement for travel expenses. Time away is one of the most used sections in employee handbooks by employees, because they all want to know what kind of paid time off or unpaid time off can they get. And in the time away section, you'll want to include any and all of the different types of time away from work that you offer. So if you offer PTO and vacation, having a policy in there about how employees accrue it, how much they accrue, and what happens to that accrual at the end of the year is a great thing to start in your employee handbook. Same with sick leave. If you are required to have paid sick leave, which there are a number of states out there that do require it, make sure that you include that in there. Holidays, list out the holidays that your office is closed and let employees know whether you plan to pay them for that holiday or not. There are many states that do not require paid holidays. If you offer parental leave, go ahead and include that policy. If you have 50 or more employees, you must include FMLA in there. There are standard policies that are out on the internet that you can utilize. You'll just want to make sure that you include pieces of information with regards to how employees can also utilize their PTO or short-term disability as part of their FMLA. If you offer short-term disability or long-term disability, include those. You need to check your state's requirements with regards to jury duty or witness leave, because there are some states that require employers to pay employees for jury duty. Others do not. They just require that an employer allow an employee the time off to participate in jury duty or witness leave. And if they are paid for their jury duty, they can keep that pay. You also can indicate whether or not an employee can utilize PTO for any time off taken for jury duty if you don't pay for it. So you'll want to have a policy there. With voting and military, those are also two specific time away from work pieces that state laws can mandate how much time you allow for individuals to take off, as well as whether or not you have to pay them for it. Some states require an employer to pay for up to 2 hours on voting day for an employee to vote. Others just say you have to give them the time off, and they can either take vacation or take it unpaid in order to vote. And with military leave, there are some components of military that fall under FMLA. Otherwise, there are state requirements and federal requirements for military leave and how an employer needs to handle that. Personal leaves of absence are things that an employer can choose to have. If you do allow individuals to take a personal leave of absence or an unpaid leave of absence, you will want to have a policy with regards to how that will be handled. For example, a personal leave of absence may require that an employee utilize their entire bank of PTO first, and then they can go unpaid. Or you can say that a personal leave of absence is only available to employees who have worked 12 months or more. that a personal leave of absence can not exceed a 2-month period. You can put specific parameters in there because you are not required to offer a personal leave of absence or an unpaid leave of absence. But if you are going to offer it, you want to make sure that you put some specific details in there for employees so they know what to expect. The benefits section, as I mentioned earlier, should really be a short section because all you want to include in the benefits section is the eligibility requirements that employees must meet in order to be eligible for benefits, and then a listing of the benefits. And you may want to include who the medical provider is, the dental provider is, the vision provider is. You also, if the employer pays a portion of the premiums, you should indicate that. You don't necessarily have to put the exact percentage or the exact dollar amount. You just want to have a listing of the various benefits that you offer and who is eligible for those. And the reason you want to keep it pretty basic without a lot of detail is because benefits change on an annual basis, and the percentage contribution that the employer makes may change. And if that happens, you don't want to have to go in and update your employee handbook all the time. What you should have is a separate benefit guide, and on an annual basis, that's the big resource that gets updated with all of the new benefit information. And most benefit providers can provide you with details to put into a benefit booklet. Some of the benefits that you would want to include in this section, of course, include your standard medical, dental, and vision insurance. If you offer flexible spending accounts or a health savings account or a health reimbursement account, you'll put that in there. If you offer a retirement plan, put that in this section, as well as life insurance, tuition reimbursement, how you handle continuing professional education and whether or not you pay for those types of things, and then any voluntary benefits that employees can sign up for through you as an employer, but that they are 100% responsible for paying for. So those are the components of a handbook, and just some general tips to keep in mind with regards to handbooks. Number one, you want to keep your handbook easy to read. You don't want it to be a bunch of legal terms straight out of employment law that employees won't understand. So keep it easy to read. You absolutely should have an at-will employment statement in your compliance section if that's applicable. There are some states that are a for-cause state, which means that they can terminate for cause. But if you are an at-will state, definitely have that in your employee handbook. You also want to make sure that somewhere in your handbook you state that the handbook is not a contract and does not promise continued employment. And make it clear that your handbook is what trumps all other and previous documents on policy, and that those policies are subject to change, and it's the employee's responsibility to stay updated on those policies. Now, as an employer, if you make a change to a policy, you should send that change out to everyone in a format that you can track whether or not they received it. So include it in a pay stub, send an email out, or you may, if it's a big enough policy that's going to require a lot of follow-up, then have the policy go out and make sure that employees sign an acknowledgement that they received it. Things to be aware of when it comes to employee handbooks. The first thing that you should be aware of is deviating from your policies. If you have a policy in your handbook, you need to stick to it. And if you're finding that it's causing more trouble than it's worth and you are deviating from that policy, then change the policy. But you want to make sure that you are handling things consistently, because when you inconsistently apply policies, you are putting yourself in a situation where one employee may claim discrimination. And that certainly isn't something that you want, because the first thing an employment law attorney is going to ask for is a copy of the handbook, and then they will go by whatever policy is in the handbook. So if you've deviated from it, you've put yourself in a losing position. You also want to be aware of adopting illegal policies or practices. You want to make sure that you don't think of a policy and not check to see if there's a state or federal law that policy might be in violation of, because the state and federal laws trump any type of organizational policy. You also want to be careful of restrictive policies, and one of them is that progressive discipline policy that I mentioned. If you have restrictive policies like that, where it says you go through step 1, then step 2, then step 3, always make sure that you include some sort of clause that indicates, depending upon the seriousness of the offense, you can move to any one of the stages at any time, right? So let's say you have a circumstance where somebody is telling a dirty joke in the workplace. That could start off with a written warning. And then if they tell another dirty joke, then you'd probably want to move away from just going to the written documentation, go straight to a performance improvement plan. Whereas if somebody is egregiously doing sexual harassment with someone, that could move straight to termination. So it just depends upon the circumstance. You want to make sure that you look at those restrictive policies and allow yourself an out to move towards immediate termination if it's violated. The other thing you want to be aware of is very vague policies. And one that comes to mind for this would be personal leave. If you do not have specific parameters in place, then that policy will be abused. And if you deny someone a personal leave, but you allow someone else a personal leave, there has to be a reason for it. So having too vague a policy is going to get you into trouble. Having something specific in place, such as you have to be an employee here for a minimum of 12 months, you need to use up all of your PTO before you go on a personal leave, and it has to be approved by your department head, which will be based on workload and the ability of the company to operate without you there, right? So put some more specifics, put some meat into your policy and avoid those vague policies. If you take one thing from this entire webinar, please take this. If you have an employee handbook, it's not enough to just have that handbook. You need to make sure that you have a signed acknowledgement. So there is an acknowledgement, a standard acknowledgement form that I include with every single one of the policies or handbooks that I create for clients. It basically shows that the employee had the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the policies. They had the opportunity to ask questions. They know who to go to for help, and they agree to the terms and the conditions of the policy manual, which means their employment, okay? Most employees will sign and date this and not have a problem with it. About 5% of employees will have some questions. If they read through it, they'll have some questions, and it usually has to do with policies such as the confidentiality policy or any type of non-compete, or you can't work outside of the, you can't have a second job, those kinds of policies. They'll have questions on it. And it's fine for them to have questions. That's actually a good thing, because then you can have the discussion with them to make sure that they actually understand things. And if you get asked the same question over and over and over, you know that you might need to modify your policy a bit so that it is clearer. Now, there are some employees who refuse to sign the acknowledgement form, and that doesn't mean they're off the hook, okay? If that happens, then you can have the employee write, "I refuse to sign," and have them date it. Or a company representative can write, "The employee refused to sign." Of course, the optimum is to get an employee to sign it. The next one would be to have the employee write, "I refuse to sign," because at least that indicates that they received the employee handbook. But if neither of those are possible, then the company representative can write, "The employee refused to sign," and I would document, you know, the date that they went through orientation, the date that the policy manual was reviewed with them, and or the date that the handbook was actually given to them. So I'm going to ask another polling question. When did you last update your employee handbook? Was it within the last year, 2 to 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or it's never been updated? All right, so we have a few who have never been updated, some within the last year. If you've been within the last year, you are probably good to go. If you have not updated your handbook within the last year, there have been some significant changes to state and federal employment laws. So you may want to consider either going through and updating your handbook yourself or going to someone to help you with that update. Handbooks should be reviewed at least annually. And if you're doing your own handbook in-house, it's a great time to do it is right after you've had benefit enrollment, because then you can go and change that benefit section. If you've added benefits, if you've taken benefits away, if you have made changes to which types of employees are eligible for benefits, you can update that section. And at that same time, just go through the different federal and state laws to update those and make sure that they are current. The things that you absolutely want to watch for and update on an annual basis are minimum wage changes, rules with regards to overtime. Before I got into HR consulting, I had no idea that different states pay out overtime very, very differently. Some states it's a straight anything over 40 hours a week. Others it's anything over 8 hours a day. Some of them it's anything over 48 hours in a week if certain circumstances apply. So you want to make sure that you know what your state law is with regards to minimum wage and overtime rules. Same thing goes for paid leave. The paid leave changes all the time. Several years ago, we never would have thought that employers had to pay for employees to go vote, but there are several states where that is a legal requirement. So you want to make sure that you're looking at voting leave, at bereavement leave. Usually that's not one that's required, but in some circumstances it is. You'll want to take a look at leaves related to mothers in the workplace because they are allowed to express breast milk or go to doctor's appointments or go to a certain number of school activities. They're allowed time off to go to their own doctor appointments when they're pregnant. So there are a lot of things that are protecting women in the workplace, and you need to make sure that you have those laws in place. I'm thinking specifically of one in the state of Minnesota. It's called WESA, the Women's Economic Security Act, and it provides all kinds of requirements for employers with regards to handling women in the workplace who have children. Same with paid sick leave laws. A lot of companies have switched over to doing PTO, which is paid time off. It combines sick leave and vacation. There are some states that require a certain number of hours of sick leave, and you want to make sure that your PTO account, if you operate utilizing PTO in those paid state or paid sick leave states, that your PTO accrual covers a minimum for the required paid sick leave plus enough for an employee to feel like they're getting vacation as well. So as long as it's a robust enough accrual, you're okay staying with a PTO policy. But if it is not, then you need to switch to a separate vacation and sick leave. You may also need to update handbooks more frequently or send notifications or changes to employees when there are state laws that change. Again, in the state of Minnesota, in July, they rolled out the Minnesota wage theft law, and it put requirements on employers to do all kinds of documenting for employees information regarding their pay. And that was something that had to be rolled out right away. So for some of my Minnesota clients, I updated that policy. We sent it out to the employees so they were aware of it. And then during the annual review of the handbook, which came later in December, we added that policy into the manual. You want to make sure that you review every single employee's personnel file to see if they have an acknowledgement form. And if they don't, you want to send a request out to them to sign a handbook acknowledgement form so that you have it in their file that they did get either the handbook or they received updates to the policy manual or different things like that. You want those signed acknowledgements. And for that very reason, if you have the ability to have an electronic or a digital handbook somewhere on a company intranet, or if you have an HRIS system that employees access for information, put it there so that employees can electronically go in there and do their acknowledgement. It's much easier to track than the paper copy acknowledgements and an Excel spreadsheet. But yeah, if you have the ability to do electronic or digital handbooks, I highly recommend going that route. All right, polling question number 4. Has having an employee handbook ever assisted you in defending a file claimed by an employee? Okay, oh my gosh, it's almost 50-50. Wow, okay, so that will show the folks out there who maybe don't have a handbook or who haven't updated it recently, the importance of having a handbook, because if an employee files a claim against an employer, as I mentioned, the first thing the employment law attorney is going to do is ask for a copy of the handbook. And if you have a handbook in place, you can demonstrate what the policy is. If you can show that the employee signed their acknowledgement form, it means that they understood what the policy was. And if they were terminated for violating a policy, it's pretty black and white. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that the average cost to defend against employee lawsuits does run into the 6 figures. And that includes lawyer fees, settlement costs, but it also includes the time of the employer that they have to spend putting together the defense to the employee's claim, right? And that's just lost time. It's time that could be spent on more futuristic things, on building the business. Nobody wants to be stuck trying to defend any type of employment claim by an employee, especially when they've done things right. The employee handbook can really, really help with that. And if you'd like a big number, 25% of cases that go to trial result in a judgment for $500,000 or more. That is a huge hit to a business, especially a nonprofit organization. So keep that in mind. You want to make sure that you have a solid handbook in place, that you review that handbook on an annual basis so that you're making sure that those state and federal laws that have popped up over the course of the year are updated and are accurately reflected in your handbook. And then you want to make sure that you communicate those changes with your employees. So that is all that I have today. Hopefully you were able to get some little piece of information that was helpful. And what I'd like to do now is just open it up for questions.
Okay, so a few questions that have come in through the chat feature. Are the headcount numbers just for full-time employees or part-time as well?
I would say your headcount numbers would be for part-time employees too, because you would expect part-time employees to also comply with your handbook. When it comes to things like FMLA or some of those other federally regulated policies, they do factor in full-time headcount, but it is so much better to be safe than sorry. Unless you have half of your staff working part-time and half of them working full-time, and there's never any chance of your full-time count going over some of the thresholds, I would put policies into place that even account for that part-time headcount.
Okay. How few is more than a few employees? We have 4 employees. Is it a requirement to have a handbook? I know it is ideal, but I just started this job and was hoping to wait until next year to create this.
Well, you can wait, but with 1 or more employee, you've got the Fair Labor Standards Act, Immigration Reform and Control Act, Employment Retirement Income Security Act, Federal Income Tax Withholding, Federal Insurance Contribution, Equal Pay Act, USERRA, the NLRA, the Uniform Guidelines for Employment Selection Procedures, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, Consumer Credit Protection. Like, there's just a whole host of laws that already apply, even if you have more than 1 employee. So can you wait? Of course you can. And there are certainly tools that you can use out there where you can get a quick and easy handbook that can get you by. But yeah, the sooner you get one, the better.
If an organization has all of these individual policies in place, with education and communication in place on where to find them, is there still a need for a handbook?
I would say that all of those policies, having them in one place, that is your handbook. So it is best to say you have a handbook, because then you can say you have an acknowledgement form, unless you are asking them to acknowledge each and every one of the policies or practices that you have out there, and I'm assuming it's in some sort of intranet, company intranet that they can access. You want to make sure that people are acknowledging that they've reviewed that policy or that process and they know what's expected of them.
Okay, Do you suggest going through your handbook before submitting it to a service to review it, or submit it first?
That really depends, and I'll give you a case in point. If I know a client has reviewed their handbook and they're just wanting me to look it over and give some basic recommendations, that's a $2,500 service. If they want me to just create theirs from scratch, it's $4,000. So it's picturing the difference, that $1,500 difference. Is it worth your time to go through it for $1,500 and do it yourself? Or is it something where you're like, no, my time is worth more than $1,500, I'll just let them create it from scratch. And I'm just using that as an example. Certainly going through it will allow you the opportunity to make it sound more like you and your organization, rather than turning it over to someone who may just use standard, just standard terminology. It's not warm and fuzzy. And if your organization is a warm, fuzzy organization, employees won't feel that through your handbook if you just have somebody else do it for you without any input.
Okay. You mentioned that there are samples of handbooks. Where can we find one to get us started?
So if you go out online, there are some tools out there. The Society of Human Resource Management, I can't remember what they charge for their basic template. It is very basic, but it at least gives you a start. Or as I mentioned, I can help create a basic one with you, utilizing your specific information for benefits and your practices and processes, so that it is specific to you and not just generic.
There's 4 more. Do you want to take those now, or do you want to answer those offline?
Sure.
Okay.
Nope, I'm fine taking them now.
Is there a list of laws that come into place when a company's number of employee reaches 11 and then 15?
So I actually found a really interesting article, and it's back from 2017, so it's not recent, but it is what I was drawing my information off of. And the title of the article, if somebody wants to take it down, is Compliance Checklist, Federal Employment Laws You Need to Know at Every Stage of Your Company's Growth. And there are similar articles that are out there, and I can even scan it, and we can send it to, I can scan this article and send it to everyone, so that's not a problem.
Okay. Is it okay to offer some employees extra benefits like more PTO in their employee contract?
I would say not in an employee contract, and that word scares me. You never want to make a contract with an employee. You want to have an agreement or something of that nature, but you can say that all managers receive PTO accrual in the amount of 15 hours a month, whereas employees receive PTO accrual in the amount of 10 hours a month. You just have to be really consistent. If you were to say, no, only this manager gets 15 hours a month, everybody else gets 10, and that person happens, well, irrelevant, somebody who is not getting that same accrual, who is at the same level of employment, could file a discrimination in employment practices claim, and they would likely win it. So just be careful with that. But you can designate that certain classifications of people earn different PTO accruals. So all managers or individuals who have been with the organization for 10 years or more are bumped from 10 to 15 hours.
Okay. Is it okay to offer, we just did that one. Do you recommend a handbook for volunteers?
Oh, that is such a good question. I don't know that it's necessarily a handbook, but I would have something that volunteers sign that makes them aware of policies, especially if they're return volunteers. And I'm hoping that's what you're getting at here, is that it's return volunteers who, come back time after time. And same thing goes for job shadowing. If you have people who are job shadowing or just doing whatever, they're not paid employees, so they're not going to get paid time off, they're not going to get benefits, but they probably should be aware of your workplace environment expectations and requirements. Who to go to if they get hurt in the office environment. Your preventing harassment policy absolutely applies to them. The smoking policy would apply to them. So just go through your handbook and maybe pull out the things that would be relevant to just about anybody who walks through your doors, and maybe have just a separate guide for them so that they review it, they sign it. If it's just a general volunteer, a one-time thing, have them sign a confidentiality clause so that they don't take anything that they learned while they were there. But other than that, you don't have to have a volunteer policy or volunteer handbook.
Do you want to continue answering or answer offline?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
We'll take these last two here. Is it best to separate the employee handbook policies from the SOP's operating policies and procedures? Should this be two separate policies?
Yes. Your standard operating procedures are more process related, and your policy manual is overriding policies about their employment. And they are two documents, but they can intertwine. For example, safety and security, that is one area that I have seen intertwine with a standard operating procedure manual and the employee handbook. The employee handbook might have just some basic terminology about safety and who to report injuries or any issues to, and then it may say, please refer to the safety section of the standard operating procedure. But they should be two different things. Otherwise, your employee handbook would be, well, I actually saw one just the other day that was 92 pages long. And an employee handbook should not be more than 40 pages, period. And that's if we're typing in a large font. So you want to keep them separate. One is process related. You go through these steps to do these things, lock out, tag out, report this injury, do those things. And then the other one is just policy.
Have you ever seen a policy about donating PTO to those that are in need of PTO for a catastrophic event?
Yes, I have seen that. And I've seen it work very, very successfully in some organizations where they limit the amount of PTO so that it makes it more likely that people will actually donate the PTO. I have a client right now who they limit it to 8 hours, period. An employee can only donate 8 hours of PTO to someone, but that makes it more likely that if there's a catastrophic event, that every employee is going to do that. The thing you're trying to get away from is employees liking this person, so they're giving a lot of PTO to this person, but this coworker who has the exact same thing happen gets minimal PTO donated to them. And it could very well be that the first person is very likable, this other person is not. Nobody gets along with that person, so they're not willing to give up their PTO. And then you kind of have a circumstance where that employee feels that they're in a hostile work environment, or that it's not fair that they didn't get it, and it must be because they're, of a different demographic, that they're a minority. So it just makes it a little bit difficult. So to do it successfully, you should have a limit as to how much a person can donate, and it should be a lower amount, just so that it makes it more likely that more people will donate. And that's the only way that I've seen it work successfully.
Okay, last question here. Excuse me, can PTO be a part of the hiring negotiations?
As a former recruiting manager, this was my least favorite negotiation tactic because it was unfair. It is unfairly giving someone something that they didn't earn that other people don't get. Certainly, if you do this, it needs to be done outside of the system, and you're going to have to deal with the fallout that comes from it, because there will be fallout. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying you can have different levels of accrual based on people's position title. Somebody who comes in as a newbie shouldn't get an additional week of PTO. A CFO should earn more PTO accrual than somebody who has no experience, right? So you can say that this level of employee, whether it's supervisor, manager, C-suite executive, and above, accrues PTO at this rate. These folks accrue it at this rate. These folks accrue it at this rate. But giving it to them as part of the recruitment negotiation can make it difficult. My recommendation there would be that, and it still could get you into trouble, they get the same accrual as everybody else, but you may have a written agreement that they're going to get an additional week that first year, and it's kind of done off the books.
All right.
meaning the person takes the time, but they don't log that it was PTO.
Awesome.
But I don't
Thank you,
recommend it.
Lori.
Yeah, no problem. All
Awesome.
right, well, thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me via email or phone, and hopefully we'll see you on another webcast.
Sounds great. Thank you, Lori. Thank you to all our participants, and we hope you have a great day.